William Carter raised his hand to slam the gate shut. He had already made up his mind before the wagon even stopped rolling. A widow, 3 children, hollow eyes and a broken axle and not a single coin between them. This was not what he posted for. He opened his mouth to say it. The words were right there, sharp and ready. Then the youngest boy looked up at him, 5 years old. Frost on his lashes, no fear in his eyes, and said, "Mister, are you the man who lives alone?" William's hand never came down. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. I promise you this one is worth every minute. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning and find out how a man who had given up on everything almost turned away the only thing that could have saved him. The notice had been tacked to the trading post board for 11 days before William Carter finally stopped arguing with himself about it. He had written it 3 times, thrown away the first 2 versions because they sounded desperate, settled on something short and blunt, the way he preferred everything in his life, short, blunt, and requiring no further explanation from anybody. Ranch cook wanted. Room and meals provided. Inquire at Silver Creek 2 miles north of Caldwell Creek Junction. That was it. No promises, no embellishment, no mention of the fact that the kitchen had gone largely unused for the better part of 8 years, or that the last warm meal he had cooked for himself was so unremarkable he could not recall a single detail of it. No mention of the fact that he had 40 head of cattle and 6 horses and 2 ranch hands who ate hardtack and dried beans 5 nights out of 7, because the man who owned the property could not bring himself to care enough about supper to do something different. He was not a man given to explaining himself. Silver Creek Ranch was a working operation, not a charity, and whoever answered that notice would be expected to work. That was the arrangement he was offering. Labor for shelter, service for sustenance. Clean and uncomplicated, the way William Carter had spent the last decade, deliberately making every arrangement in his life. Roy Tillman, his senior ranch hand, had read the notice over his shoulder and said nothing for a long moment. "You sure about this, boss?" "I wrote it, didn't I?" "Writing something and being sure about it ain't always the same thing." William had taken the notice from his own hands and tacked it to the board himself, pressing the nail in harder than necessary. "Somebody who can cook a proper meal and keep the kitchen in order. That's all I'm looking for." Roy had looked at him the way Roy always looked at him when he thought William was lying to himself, steady, patient, mouth pressed flat. "All right," was all he said. That had been 11 days ago. Nobody came. The trading post keeper, old Gerald Marsh, told him 3 people had read it and walked away. A 4th had asked about wages and left when William's written terms turned out to be room and board, only no coin. William had not budged on that point. He was not running a boarding house. He was offering a working arrangement. If that wasn't sufficient for somebody, they were welcome to find their meals elsewhere. December arrived in Montana Territory in 1881, the way it always did, without apology and without mercy. The temperature dropped 17 degrees in a single night. Ice formed along the creek banks before sunrise. William's 2 ranch hands, Roy Tillman and a younger man named Pete Aldrich, started their morning chores in the dark and finished them in the dark, and the 3 of them ate in near silence most evenings because there was nothing particularly worth saying, and the cold had a way of making words feel wasteful. William was 46 years old. He had built Silver Creek Ranch with his own hands starting at age 29, back when the land was raw and untested, and so was he. He had done it beside his wife Margaret, who had died of fever in the winter of 1873, taking with her the child she was carrying, and something inside William that he had never been entirely able to name or locate or recover. He had kept working. That was what you did. You kept your hands moving and your eyes forward, and you did not allow yourself to stop long enough to feel the full weight of what you were carrying, because if you stopped, you might not start again. 8 years had passed that way. The ranch was doing well enough by any measure a reasonable man would apply. The cattle were healthy, the fences were solid. He had a reputation in Caldwell Creek as a fair dealer and a hard worker, which was the only reputation he had ever cared to cultivate. People respected him. They also mostly left him alone, which suited him fine. What they did not do was come to supper. What they did not do was fill the kitchen with anything resembling warmth. What they did not do was make the house feel like anything other than a structure that kept the wind off a man's shoulders while he slept. On the morning of December 9th, William rose before dawn, the way he always did, pulled on his boots in the dark, and went to the window to check the sky. The wagon appeared at his gate at 7:30. He saw it from the barn, where he was checking on one of the mares who had been favoring her left foreleg. He heard the wheels first, the particular complaint of an axle that had been pushed past its reasonable limits, and then he stepped to the barn door and looked out across the frozen yard. It was a weathered prairie schooner, the canvas cover patched in no fewer than 4 places, with material that did not match the original. The horse pulling it was a brown gelding of considerable age, and even from a distance, William could see the animal was tired in a way that a night's rest was not going to fix. The wagon came to a stop just short of his gate, and for a moment nothing happened. Then a woman climbed down from the seat. She was somewhere in her early 30s, though the particular quality of exhaustion she was carrying made a precise estimate difficult. Dark chestnut hair tucked under a bonnet that had seen better seasons. A gray dress that might have been fine once, a long time ago, in a different life. She moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been in pain for so long, she had learned to work around it without thinking the way a person learns to favor a bad knee. She opened the gate herself, pushed it back, led the gelding through. William set down the rag he had been using on the mare's leg and walked to the barn door. He watched the woman guide her wagon into his yard, like she had already decided she was coming in, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to that decision. 3 children climbed out of the wagon bed behind her, a boy of perhaps 13, a girl he guessed at 9 or 10, and a small child, a boy who could not have been more than 5 years old and who was wearing a coat 2 sizes too large for him. The sleeves rolled back to expose his small hands. The smallest one looked straight at William the moment his feet hit the ground. No hesitation, no wariness. Just that wide, frank, curious look that children had before the world taught them better. William walked toward them. He had already decided what he was going to say. It formed clearly in his mind as he crossed the yard, each word sitting in its proper place, firm and final. I posted for a cook. 1 person. I don't have arrangements for a family, and I'm not in a position to make them. I'm sorry for your trouble, and I can point you toward town. Reasonable, respectful, impossible to argue with. He was within 10 feet of the woman when she turned to face him, and he saw her eyes clearly for the first time. They were gray, like river water in November, and they held something that was not quite defeat and not quite defiance, but occupied the particular space where the 2 of them had been fighting each other for so long that neither one had won. She spoke before he could. "You're William Carter." It was not a question. "I am," he said. "You posted for a cook." "I did." She held his gaze without flinching. "My name is Evelyn Brooks. My husband Daniel passed 4 months ago. Influenza." She said it the way people said things they had repeated enough times that the saying of it had become separate from the feeling of it. "We had a farm in Nebraska, lost it to the bank 6 weeks after we lost him. I've been traveling since October." William said nothing. "I can cook," she said. "I can manage a kitchen preserved food. Keep accounts if you need that too. I worked beside my husband every day for 12 years, and I know livestock well enough to be useful outside the kitchen if the situation calls for it." She paused for half a breath. "I saw your notice at Marsh's trading post. Gerald told me you hadn't had any takers." "That's true," William said. "I need the work." She did not lower her eyes when she said it, which he noticed. Most people, when they admitted need, looked somewhere else. She did not. "And I do not come without my children. Thomas is 13 and he works. Clara is 9 and she helps where she can. Samuel is 5. She glanced briefly at the small boy who was still watching William with that same unguarded attention. "If you need a cook, Mr. Carter, you get all 4 of us. Or you get none of us. I won't apologize for that, and I won't negotiate it. William looked at her. He looked at the 3 children standing behind her. The older boy with his jaw set and his shoulders squared clearly, trying to appear older than he was. The girl watching him with dark, careful eyes. And the small one with the oversized coat, who at that precise moment tilted his head and said without apparent awareness that he was saying something remarkable. "Mister, are you the man who lives alone?" The silence that followed was complete. Evelyn's expression shifted a flash of something that might have been mortification, and she began to speak. "Samuel, you don't—" "It's all right," William said. He was not certain why he said it. He looked at the boy. 5 years old, frost on his lashes, no fear anywhere in his face. "I am," William said. The boy nodded, apparently satisfied with this information, the way children were satisfied when the world confirmed what they had already suspected. William looked back at Evelyn Brooks. The practical case against this arrangement was extensive, and he knew every point of it without having to work to recall them. He had one spare room off the kitchen that had been used for storage since 1876. The bunkhouse where Roy and Pete slept had no room for a family. His budget for labor did not extend to feeding 4 additional mouths through a Montana winter. He had not planned for children. He had, if he was being honest with himself, in the way he rarely permitted, spent the last 8 years organizing his entire existence around the avoidance of anything that might require him to feel the specific kind of grief that came from caring about people who could leave or be taken. He knew all of that. He said, "The storage room off the kitchen will need to be cleared. There's a wood stove in there that I don't believe has been used in 5 years, so we'll need to check the flue before you light it. Roy can help you with that this afternoon." Evelyn looked at him. A long moment passed. "All right," she said quietly. "Breakfast is at 6. The hands eat before they go out. I eat whatever's available when I come in, which is usually midday. Supper at 7 if the weather allows it. I don't have particular preferences, but I have a strong preference against waste, so whatever you make it with what we have, and no more." "I understand. The room and meals I can provide. Wages will have to wait until spring when I sell." She nodded. "That's fair." He started to turn back toward the barn. Something stopped him. He turned back, looked at the older boy. "What's your name again?" "Thomas, sir." "Thomas." William considered him. "You said you work." "Yes, sir." "You ever worked with horses?" Thomas straightened slightly. "Some. Yes, sir. I've got a mare in the barn favoring her left foreleg. I was about to finish wrapping it. Come on." Thomas glanced at his mother. Evelyn gave a small nod. The boy turned and fell into step beside William without another word, which was, William would reflect later, the beginning of something he had not been looking for and had no framework to understand. Roy Tillman was coming out of the bunkhouse when William crossed the yard with Thomas at his heels, and Roy stopped walking when he saw the wagon and the woman and the 2 remaining children beside it. He looked at William. His expression held the particular quality of a man who had learned over many years that William Carter did unexpected things from time to time, and that the best response was patience. "Roy," William said, "the storage room off the kitchen needs to be cleared today. Check the flue on that wood stove before dark. Mrs. Brooks and her children will be staying." Roy looked at Evelyn, looked back at William. "Yes, sir," he said in the same tone he always used, which contained absolutely nothing you could object to. "And introduce Pete to the situation before supper so it doesn't come as a surprise to him." "Yes, sir." William kept walking. Thomas kept pace beside him. Inside the barn, the mare shifted when they entered, and William went to her left side, running his hand down her leg in the practiced way of a man who had been reading animals longer than he had been reading people. Thomas stood at a respectful distance watching. "You know what you're looking at?" William asked, not turning his head. "Swelling just above the fetlock," Thomas said. "She been favoring it long." William looked at the boy sideways. 3 days. My father kept 2 mares. One of them had something similar. He soaked it in cold water from the creek for about 20 minutes, morning and night, and it came right in a week. "That's what I've been doing," William said. Then it'll come right? Thomas said, with the simple confidence of someone reporting information rather than offering an opinion. William wrapped the leg with careful efficiency, the boy watching every movement. When he finished, he stood and looked at Thomas Brooks directly for what was probably the first time. The boy had his mother's eyes. That same gray, that same quality of something held in reserve. He was going to be a tall man. He already had the frame for it, though it hadn't filled out yet. "Your father," William said. "Was he a rancher?" "Farmer," Thomas said. "But he had livestock." He said they were different things, but not as different as ranchers like to pretend. William almost smiled. He did not quite permit himself to do so. He wasn't wrong. They stood together in the barn for a moment, in the kind of silence that did not require filling. "Where are you from originally?" William asked. "Nebraska," Thomas said. "Before that, Indiana. We moved west when I was 7. "You remember Indiana?" "Some of it." He paused. "I remember my father being less tired there." The observation landed with more weight than the boy probably intended. William turned back to the mare, giving her one final check. "I'll need fence posts split this afternoon on the east side," he said. "Think you can handle that?" Thomas said, "Yes, sir," without hesitation. "Good." William moved toward the barn door. "Lunch when your mother has something ready. Till then you work." "Yes, sir." That afternoon, while Roy Tillman cleared 8 years of accumulated odds and ends from the storage room and carried the smaller pieces of furniture back into usable positions, while Pete Aldrich checked the flue and declared it serviceable with only minor adjustment, while Thomas split fence posts in the east field with the methodical determination of someone proving something that nobody had asked him to prove. While all of this was happening, Evelyn Brooks stood in William Carter's kitchen for the first time. She stood there for a full minute without touching anything. The kitchen was not in catastrophic condition. It was clean in the way that spaces were clean when they were used minimally and without affection, surfaces wiped down. Nothing left out to spoil everything in its utilitarian place. But the cast iron pans on their hooks had not been properly seasoned in years. The breadboard had a long crack down the center that had been left untended. The larder was stocked with practical things: dried beans, salt pork, hardtack, a modest supply of cornmeal, some tinned goods, and almost nothing that spoke of cooking as something a person did for pleasure or for love. Clara appeared at her elbow. "It's sadder than our kitchen in Nebraska," Clara said. "Clara." "It's true, Mama." Evelyn looked at her daughter. At 9 years old, Clara Brooks had a particular talent for stating facts that everyone else was dancing carefully around, which was simultaneously one of her most useful qualities and one of her most inconvenient ones. "It's a working kitchen," Evelyn said. "It just needs to be treated like one. The pans need to be reseasoned, I can tell from here." "You're right. And we'll do that." "And someone should fix that breadboard. That crack is going to split it all the way through if it gets wet." "Also true." Clara considered the room with the evaluative look she applied to most situations. "He doesn't cook in here much, does he?" "No," Evelyn said. "He doesn't. Because he lives alone." "Yes." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Samuel asked him if he was the man who lives alone." "I know." "Was that bad?" Evelyn thought about the look on William Carter's face when Samuel had said it. Not offense, not impatience. Something else entirely, a quick thing, a flinch that was not physical, something moving behind the eyes that disappeared almost before it arrived. "No," she said. "I don't think it was bad." She tied her apron and started with the pans. Samuel, meanwhile, had discovered the barn. William Carter came around the corner of the bunkhouse at 2:30 in the afternoon to find his smallest and most unexplained guest seated in the dirt outside the barn door, talking conversationally to a large gray cat that William had not thought about in months and had frankly forgotten was still living there. The cat was not a friendly animal by any available measure. It had arrived on the property 3 years prior under circumstances William had never fully understood, and it regarded most human beings with what could only be described as principled disdain. Roy Tillman had tried to make friends with it the previous spring, and received a scratch across the back of his hand for his trouble. The cat was now sitting less than a foot from Samuel Brooks, apparently listening. William stopped walking. "He's real old," Samuel said to William, noticing him immediately. "He's got gray in his whiskers." "He does," William agreed. "What's his name?" "He doesn't have one." William paused. "He's not much of a friendly cat." "He's friendly to me," Samuel said with the breezy certainty of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned to doubt his own evidence. "I think he was just waiting for someone to talk to." The cat looked at William with an expression of complete indifference. William said, "Stay out of the barn when the hands are working in there. It's not safe with tools moving around." "Yes, sir." "You can sit out here." "Yes, sir." William kept walking. He was almost to the fence line before he stopped and stood still for a moment with his hand on the post looking out at the east field, where Thomas was still splitting wood with steady, unhurried strokes. Something had shifted. He could not have named it precisely. The ranch was the same ranch it had been this morning. The work was the same work. The cold was the same cold. But there was noise now in the afternoon of a kind the property had not produced in a very long time. The sound of a hammer from the storage room. The sound of wood splitting in the east field. The sound, distant and almost inaudible, of a woman moving through a kitchen with purpose. He did not let himself think too much about what it meant. He had work to do, and thinking too much was a luxury he had learned early did not pay for itself. Supper that evening was bean soup with salt pork and fresh cornbread. It was simple food. There was nothing about it that should have made it remarkable. William had eaten cornbread many times in his life, at many tables, in many circumstances. He could not explain in any rational terms. He was willing to apply to the situation why this particular cornbread produced in his own kitchen, in his own cast-iron pan by a woman he had known for approximately 9 hours, tasted so completely different from anything he had eaten in the last 8 years. He ate 2 pieces before he caught himself and stopped. Roy Tillman across the table was watching him with that careful, patient expression. Pete Aldrich was on his 3rd piece of cornbread and looked wholly unconcerned with anything except the cornbread. Thomas Brooks sat across from William and ate with quiet efficiency, like a person who was accustomed to eating quickly and without ceremony. Clara was asking Pete Aldrich about horses in a focused, methodical way that suggested she was conducting an interview rather than having a conversation. Samuel had fallen asleep at the table before the meal was finished, and Evelyn had quietly collected him and carried him back to the storage room without interrupting anyone's supper. Returning a few minutes later to sit in the chair she had apparently claimed as her own and eat what was left. William watched this without appearing to watch it. The table had not looked like this in a long time. Not loud, not festive, not any of those things, but occupied in a way that a table was meant to be occupied by different people with different faces and different amounts of appetite filling the spaces that silence usually owned. He pushed back his chair. "Good meal," he said to the room generally. Evelyn looked up. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." He put his coat on and went outside to do the last check of the evening on the animals. It was very cold. The sky was clear in the way Montana skies were clear in December, immense and dark and indifferent to the small warmth of human habitation beneath them. William walked the fence line the way he did every evening, checking the same points, confirming the same things, following the same route his feet had followed for years. He passed the east fence where Thomas had been working this afternoon. The fence posts were done. Clean work. Evenly spaced, solidly set, done right. He stood there for a moment looking at it. He did not know what he was going to do with these 4 people. The practical logistics of the situation were manageable. The room was functional. The food was clearly not going to be a problem. The older boy was evidently capable. None of that was the issue. The issue was something harder to articulate. The issue was that in one single day, his house had become a different kind of place, and he was not sure whether he was equipped to live in it. He went back inside, checked that the wood stoves were properly banked, and went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. Through the wall of his room, he could hear very faintly the particular quality of quiet that came from other people sleeping in a house. The small sounds, the settling breaths, the sense of inhabited space. He had forgotten what that sounded like. He had forgotten that a house could sound different depending on whether there was anyone in it. He lay in the dark and listened to his house sound like a different place than it had been yesterday, and he did not know what to do with that, so he did what he always did with things he did not know what to do with. He filed it away, left it alone, went to sleep. In the morning, he would work. That was what you did. The first week passed in a series of small collisions between the life William Carter had built and the life that had arrived at his gate without warning. He came in from the early morning check one day to find Clara at the kitchen table with his ledger open in front of her, not writing in it, just reading it with the focused intensity she apparently brought to everything. He stopped in the doorway. "That's private," he said. Clara looked up without alarm. "I know, I'm sorry. I wasn't going to touch anything. I was just reading the numbers." She paused. "Your hay costs are very high for the quantity you're buying." William looked at her. "There's a farm about 8 miles west," Clara said, "that sold hay for less than you're paying last winter. Gerald Marsh told Mama when we stopped there. I thought you might want to know." He looked at the 9-year-old sitting at his table with his ledger and his numbers and information she had gathered from the trading post keeper about his supply costs, delivering it to him with complete unselfconscious helpfulness. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. 8 miles west," he said. "You remember the name?" "Hargrove," she said. "Arthur Hargrove." "I know Hargrove. Haven't dealt with him in a few years." He looked at the ledger, looked at the numbers she had apparently been examining. "You read accounts?" "Papa taught me," she said simply. He said women who could read accounts didn't have to rely on anybody else to tell them whether they were being cheated. He considered this. "Your father was right," he said. Clara seemed to find this satisfying in a restrained way. She closed the ledger carefully spine first, the way someone who respected books would handle one, and pushed it back to its original position. "I'm going to help Mama with the bread," she said. "All right." She left. William sat alone at the table for a moment looking at the ledger. Then he picked it up, turned to the hay purchase records, and did the math on what he'd been paying versus what Hargrove might offer. Clara had not been wrong. He had been overpaying for hay for 3 years. He went to find Roy. Henry Lawson came to the ranch on the 10th day. Henry Lawson owned the largest property in the valley, 3 times the acreage of Silver Creek, and he occupied the particular position in the social landscape of Caldwell Creek that wealth and longevity in a place could sometimes manufacture, not quite respected, not quite feared, but accounted for in most calculations. He was a man who had an opinion about most things, and the resources to make those opinions matter, which was not always the same as being right, but could sometimes produce similar results. He came alone, which was unusual. He rode up to the main house on a roan stallion and looked at the wagon still parked by the fence, with an expression that communicated everything he intended to say before he'd said a word. William was on the porch when Lawson arrived. "Carter," Lawson said, not dismounting. "Lawson. Heard you had company." "You heard right." Lawson looked at the house, at the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, at the clothesline Roy had helped put up between the storage room and the barn, where several small items of children's clothing were freezing in the December air. "Widow woman," Lawson said. 3 kids. "That's correct." "Hired her?" "Yes." Lawson worked something around in his mouth like a man sorting through various things he might say, and trying to determine which one would land best. "That's a considerable burden to take on, Bill. A widow's one thing, children are another. 3 children in a working ranch operation." "My operation," William said. Lawson paused. "I'm aware of that," Lawson said, his tone adjusting slightly. "I'm simply offering a neighbor's perspective. You've run a tight ship here for a long time, bringing in complications." "I hired a cook," William said, "and a capable one. That's the extent of what I did." Lawson looked at him for a long moment. His expression held the patient, knowing quality of a man who believed he understood a situation better than the person in it. "She's got no people?" Lawson asked. "She didn't say, and I didn't ask." "Where's she from?" "Nebraska." "She have references. She told me what she could do. She's been doing it." He kept his voice even. "If you came out here to see whether I'd taken leave of my senses, Lawson, you can report back to town that I'm in full possession of them. If you came for another reason, I'm listening." Lawson looked at him for another moment, then did something that surprised William slightly. He let it go. Shifted the subject. "Heard there might be some rough weather coming in from the north," Lawson said. "Late December, maybe early January. Bad one, they're saying." "I've heard the same. If it's as bad as some folks are predicting, you'll want your supplies in order before it hits." "I'm aware. We could talk about a mutual aid arrangement, same as 2 winters ago." "That arrangement worked well enough," William allowed. "We can talk about it." Lawson nodded. He gave the house one final look. The clothesline, the smoke, the evidence of people living where no people had been for a long time. And then he turned the stallion and rode back down the lane without saying anything further. William stood on the porch until the sound of hooves was gone. He knew what Lawson's visit meant. He knew that Caldwell Creek was already talking, already measuring, already forming the particular kind of opinion that small communities formed about individuals who did unexpected things. He knew that some of those opinions would be sympathetic, and some of them would be suspicious, and some of them would be the specific kind of social arithmetic that always involved people deciding whether a widow and her children represented opportunity or burden. He didn't care what they decided. He went back inside. The days settled into a rhythm that was new and strange, and if he was honest with himself in the privacy of his own mind, not unpleasant. Thomas rode out with William and Roy 3 mornings a week to check the cattle. He was a quick student, and he asked the right questions, not too many, not too few, and always about things that mattered rather than things that were simply interesting. William found himself explaining things he had not explained to anyone in years, the small particular knowledge that accumulated in a man after decades of working the same land, and there was something in the act of explaining it that felt like use, like material that had been sitting idle, finally doing the work it was meant for. Clara managed the kitchen accounts. This was not something William had intended or planned for. It had simply evolved over the course of 2 weeks until it was simply the way things were. Clara sitting at the kitchen table each morning with the supply lists and the cost records, checking quantities, flagging discrepancies, occasionally producing small handwritten notes that she left on William's desk about things she believed required attention. The handwriting was remarkably clear for a 9-year-old. The arithmetic was entirely correct. He didn't comment on it directly, but he did not stop her. Samuel continued to be Samuel, which was to say, everywhere at once, asking questions at a rate that somewhat defied the amount of time available in any given day, and operating without the particular wariness that had been hammered into most of the people William dealt with. "How come your barn is bigger than your house?" Samuel asked one afternoon, appearing at William's shoulder while William was checking a gate hinge. "Because there are more animals than people," William said. Samuel considered this. "That seems like a good reason." "I thought so." "Mr. Carter." "What? Do you like having us here?" William looked at the hinge, at the small, persistent person beside him. "I like having the work done," he said carefully. Samuel appeared to receive this as an incomplete answer, but not a hostile one. "Thomas says you gave him extra lumber to fix the coop without him having to ask for it." "The coop needed fixing." "He says that's how you say thank you, giving someone what they need without them having to ask." William was quiet for a moment. "Your brother talks a lot," he said. "We all do," Samuel said cheerfully. "Mama says it's because Papa was quiet and it balanced out." William went back to the hinge, but the words stayed with him the way certain things did not. Loudly, not urgently, but present in the way a stone was present in a boot, noticeable without requiring constant attention. Daniel Brooks, it seemed, had been a quiet man, a farmer from Nebraska who kept 2 mares and taught his daughter to read accounts and raised a 13-year-old who set fence posts clean and a 5-year-old who asked every question in the visible universe, and a wife who walked onto a stranger's property in December, with her chin up and her children behind her, and told him flat that he could take all 4 of them, or none of them. William thought not for the first time that Daniel Brooks must have been a man of considerable character. He thought about this alone in the barn in the dark with a specificity that surprised him. Evelyn herself was the part of the equation he had handled least well, which was to say, he had not handled it at all. He had given her the kitchen and the storage room and the working arrangement, and he had been scrupulously careful to treat her with exactly the same professional transactional courtesy he would have extended to any competent worker, and she had been equally scrupulously careful to do the same in return. They spoke about the meals, the supplies, the household accounts, the children. They did not speak about Nebraska. They did not speak about Daniel Brooks. They did not speak about what had happened to her and what had brought her to his gate. They did not speak about what had happened to William, because there was no particular reason he could identify why he would be telling her about Margaret. And yet, there were moments. She handed him coffee one morning, the cup placed on the corner of the table at the exact angle he always picked it up from, and he realized she had been watching him long enough to know how he took his coffee before he had told her, and the realization sat somewhere in his chest, in a way that was not comfortable and not painful, but simply present. She said one evening when Thomas had gone to bed and Clara was reading, and Samuel was long since asleep, and Roy and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet. "The flue in the storage room pulls a little slow. If Thomas banks the stove too high at night, it smokes." "I'll look at it," William said. "I've been managing it," she said. "I just wanted you to know in case." "I appreciate that." She was quiet for a moment, her hands around her own coffee cup. "He's a good boy," she said. "Thomas, he works hard because he wants to, not because he has to. I want you to know I don't ask him to prove himself." "I know you don't," William said. She looked at him. "He does it because he's 13 and he lost his father, and he thinks if he can be useful enough, things will stop being as uncertain as they currently are," William said. "It's not a bad strategy. Mostly it works." Evelyn was still looking at him. "You recognize it," she said quietly, not accusing, just observing. He looked at his coffee cup. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Brooks," he said. 6 o'clock comes early." She rose without argument, took her cup to the wash basin, set it down. At the door of the kitchen, she stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for the lumber for the coop." He said nothing. She went to bed. William sat alone in his kitchen with his coffee going cold in his hands. And outside the window, the Montana sky was full of stars, and for the first time in 8 years, the house around him was not completely silent. He sat there for a long time. Then he got up, banked the stove, and went to bed. There was weather coming, they all said so, and there was work to do before it arrived. The weather changed on a Tuesday. William felt it before he saw it, that particular shift in the air that a man learned to read. After enough Montana winters, a drop in pressure that sat behind the eyes and in the joints and communicated itself through the body before the sky had done anything visible to confirm it. He was out by the eastern fence line when it hit him, that feeling, and he stood still for a moment with his hand on a post and looked north. The clouds up there were the wrong color. Not the soft gray of ordinary December weather. Something harder. Something with intention. He turned back toward the house. Roy was crossing the yard when William came in from the field, and one look at William's face told Roy everything the sky had not yet finished saying. "How bad?" Roy asked. "Don't know yet," William said. "Bad enough. Get Pete and start moving the supply inventory. I want to know exactly what we have before nightfall." Roy nodded and went. William went inside. Evelyn was at the stove. She turned when he came in, read something in his expression, and set down the spoon she was holding. "Storm," she said. "Looks like." "How long do we have?" 2 days. Maybe 3 if we're lucky." He moved to the larder, opened it, looked at what was there with a different set of eyes than he'd been using the last 2 weeks. Not the eyes of a man keeping a household, but the eyes of a man calculating survival margins. "How are we on flour?" 40 pounds, maybe a little more. Salt pork, 2 full slabs. I was planning to start the third this week. Don't. Save it. He closed the larder. I need you to think about what you'd need to feed 6 people 7 if we count Samuel for 3 weeks without resupply. Not comfortably. Adequately. Evelyn didn't blink. She looked at the ceiling for exactly 4 seconds, running numbers in her head, the way Clara looked at account books, and then she looked back at him. We're short on cornmeal, and we'll burn through the dried beans faster than you think with this cold. The bread flour will stretch, but not indefinitely. What do you have in the secondary cellar? He stopped. How do you know about the secondary cellar? Clara found it, Evelyn said. 3 days ago. She said it looked like it hadn't been opened in a long time, and she left it alone because it wasn't her place to go in. William stood very still for a moment. Smart girl, he said. Yes, Evelyn said simply. She is. He went to the secondary cellar, which was accessible through a door in the floor of the back room that he genuinely had not opened in approximately 2 years, having fallen into the habit of letting Roy manage the primary supply, and not thinking much beyond that. He lifted the door, went down the short stairs, held up the lantern he'd taken from the hook by the door. Thomas was behind him before he reached the bottom step. Can I help? Thomas said. William looked at him. The boy had appeared from nowhere, the way he always did when there was something practical being organized, a kind of useful instinct that William had started relying on without quite deciding to. Hold the light, William said. Thomas took the lantern. What was in the secondary cellar was more than William remembered and less than he needed. 2 crates of tinned goods beans, some tomatoes, 3 tins of peaches that were either still good or well past it. A barrel of salt that was crusted on top but sound underneath. Several pounds of dried corn he'd forgotten about. Some preserves, maybe 6 or 7 jars, the labels faded enough that he couldn't read them in this light. Peaches, Thomas said, holding the lantern over the nearest crate with the expression of someone identifying something personally significant. Samuel likes peaches, William said without knowing why he said it. He does, Thomas confirmed. Mama used to make peach preserves in August. He'd eat them straight off the spoon before she could get the lids on. A pause. Before. That word in a boy's voice carrying a weight no 13-year-old should have learned to carry yet. William picked up the nearest jar of preserves and turned it in the lantern light. Plum, he thought. Margaret had put these up. The thought arrived, and he set it down carefully, not on the shelf, but in the part of his mind where he put things that required more space than the present moment allowed. Bring the tinned goods up, he said. All of it. I want Evelyn to see what we have. They spent the rest of the afternoon in organized preparation. Roy and Pete moved the cattle to the secondary barn, which was more sheltered, working fast and without complaint. Thomas carried supplies, while William reinforced the barn doors against wind load. The particular kind of reinforcement that experience had taught him could be the difference between a barn that stood and one that did not. Evelyn cooked a large pot of stew that would serve as the evening meal and also be preserved against the following days, working with a focused economy of motion that William found himself watching sideways when he came through the kitchen. She didn't waste anything. Not a movement, not a calorie of heat from the stove, not a spoonful of anything that could be stretched. She worked the way he worked, efficiently, without performance, with the specific quality of competence that came not from training, but from a long and serious education in necessity. He noticed this. He did not say anything about it. Clara was at the kitchen table keeping a running inventory list in handwriting that remained, as always, remarkably legible. She asked each person who came through what they'd found and what it weighed and wrote it down, and when William passed through the 3rd time, she held up the list without being asked, and he took it and read it and found it precisely accurate. Good, he said, and handed it back. Clara looked at him with the gray eyes she'd taken from her mother. We're going to be all right, she said. It was not a question. We're going to be all right, William said. He meant it. He would not have said it otherwise. Samuel appeared at the kitchen door at that point, the large gray cat under his arm, like a parcel he'd decided to carry somewhere, and said, "Mr. Carter, can Biscuit come inside during the storm?" Evelyn turned from the stove. "Samuel, you are not naming that animal." "I already named him," Samuel said. "He told me his name." "Cats don't tell you their names." "He told me in cat," Samuel said, with the absolute patience of someone explaining something that should be obvious. William looked at the cat, which was enduring its new name, and its transport with the expression of an animal conducting a complex internal negotiation. He looked at Samuel. "He can stay in the back room," William said. "Not the kitchen." Samuel appeared to weigh this. "That's fair," he said, which was something he said frequently, and which William had come to understand was the signal that Samuel had decided to accept a situation rather than continue to negotiate it. He carried the cat Biscuit toward the back room with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something valuable. Evelyn watched this happen, then looked at William. He had already started back toward the barn, but he heard her quietly behind him. "Thank you." He kept walking. The night before the storm fully arrived, William could not sleep. He lay in the dark of his room and listened to the wind beginning to build outside, testing the eaves and the corners of the house the way wind always did in Montana, before it got serious, exploratory, almost gentle, as if it was finding the weak points before it committed. He knew this house's weak points as well as he knew anything. He'd patched and reinforced and battled them for 15 years. He was not worried about the house. He was thinking about Thomas Brooks. Specifically, he was thinking about something Thomas had said that afternoon while they were reinforcing the barn doors, working on opposite sides of the same board, William driving the spikes, and Thomas holding steady against the wind load that was already building. Thomas had said out of nowhere with the abruptness of something that had been sitting in him for a while before it came out. "My father used to say that a storm showed you who people really were. Not the big things, the small things. Who remembered to check on the animals last. Who didn't sleep until everyone else was settled." William had kept working. "He said it was the only test that mattered," Thomas said. "Your father said a lot of things worth remembering," William said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Do you think about being alone a lot, I mean, before we came?" The question was direct enough that it required a direct answer. "Sometimes," William said. "Does it feel different now? I'm not trying to be. I just mean, does the house feel different?" William drove the last spike. Tested the board. Solid. "Yes," he said. "It does." Thomas nodded like a man checking something off a mental list. They finished the door in silence, but it was the kind of silence that had weight in it. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but full of something that neither of them had the exact words for, and that neither of them was in a hurry to name. William lay in the dark now and thought about that conversation, and about the fact that he had told a 13-year-old boy something true that he had not told anyone in several years, and about what that meant if it meant anything. He didn't reach a conclusion. He got up at 4 in the morning because sleep wasn't coming and went to the kitchen to bank up the fire. Evelyn was already there. She was sitting at the table in the dark with her hands around a cup of something warm, and she looked up when he came in without any of the startled quality that most people had when they were caught somewhere unexpected. She just looked at him, and he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Couldn't sleep," she said. It was not an apology. "No," he said. He went to the stove, checked it added wood. The fire caught quickly. He stood with his back to her for a moment, watching the fire settle, and then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. This was new. He was aware that it was new. "Are you worried about the storm?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "I've handled worse. The preparations are sound." "Then what are you thinking about?" He looked at her. In the firelight, she looked different than she did in daylight, softer in some ways, sharper in others. The tiredness still there, but the guardedness she carried during the day somewhat lowered. "Thomas asked me something today," he said. "He told me," she said. "He said he might have been too forward." He wasn't. She looked at her cup. He worries that he asks too much of the people who are kind to us. He gets it from Daniel. Daniel always worried about taking up too much space. There's plenty of space, William said. She smiled at that. Not a large smile, not a performed one. The kind of smile that happened before a person had decided to smile, the reflexive kind. He likes you, she said. Thomas, he doesn't say it, but he watches you the way he used to watch Daniel, trying to understand how a man handles things. William said nothing. I'm telling you that because I think you should know it, not to make you uncomfortable. She met his eyes. And because if you're going to have him working beside you, you ought to know what it means to him. The fire popped. The wind was picking up outside. The exploratory phase was ending, and something more purposeful was beginning. His father worked quietly, William said. Thomas told me. Yes, Daniel was. He wasn't a man of many words. He was a man of many actions. He showed up. That was what he did. Every single time he showed up. She paused. It's a hard thing to teach a child by example, because once the example is gone, the lesson has to hold on its own. It's holding, William said. She looked at him. Thomas is fine, he said. Whatever you're worried about with him, he's fine. He's more than fine. Evelyn's hands tightened slightly around her cup. She looked at the table. Thank you, she said quietly. And he understood that this particular thank you was carrying considerably more than the words themselves. They sat in silence for a while. The wind pushed at the house. The fire held. What happened to your wife? Evelyn said. He hadn't expected that. Most people didn't ask directly. They talked around it, or they left it alone, or they asked Roy and received whatever Roy was willing to share, which was not much. Margaret, he said. Fever. Winter of 73. He paused. She was with child. We lost them both. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then, I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it smaller? No, he thought. It doesn't. How long were you married? She asked. 6 years. Were you happy? The question was so direct that it almost made him laugh. Yes, he said. We were. Daniel and I were happy too, she said. Not easy. Happy isn't always easy, but yes. She turned her cup in her hands. I think sometimes people assume that because a marriage was happy, a person heals from the loss of it more easily. I've found it's the opposite. He looked at her. Because there's nothing to be angry about, she said. With a hard marriage, you have anger to lean on. It holds you up for a while. With a good one, you just have the missing. And missing is heavier. William sat with that for a long time. Yes, he said finally. That's exactly right. Outside, the storm was arriving, and inside, at a kitchen table at 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 people who had each built their solitude into a fortress were sitting across from each other in the firelight, and the walls were a little lower than they had been the day before. The storm hit in full by noon the following day. It came in from the north, the way William had known it would, fast and absolute, the temperature dropping 30 degrees in 6 hours, the snow horizontal, in the wind by early afternoon. By 3 o'clock, it was dark enough that the lanterns were necessary, and by nightfall the world outside the windows was a white blank that told you nothing about direction or distance. William ran the ranch in storm conditions the way he ran it in everything, with precision and without panic. He moved between the house and the barn on a rope line he'd strung that morning, checking the animals on a schedule, never staying out long enough for the cold to take a serious hold. Roy and Pete did the same on alternating shifts. The cattle were restless, but protected. The horses were better horses in William's experience, had a philosophical quality about weather that cattle lacked entirely. Thomas wanted to help with the barn runs. No, William said. Thomas looked at him with his jaw set in a way that was becoming familiar. I'm not a child. You're 13. My father had me doing full storm work at 12. Your father knew you for 12 years. I've known you for 18 days. William met the boy's eyes. When I know you better, we'll talk about the rope line. For now, you help inside. That's not a small thing. Thomas held the gaze for a moment. Then, "Yes, sir." He turned and went back inside. Roy, who had witnessed this exchange from across the kitchen, caught William's eye and said absolutely nothing. But the careful blankness of his expression communicated something in the neighborhood of approval. What Thomas did inside was not in fact a small thing. He managed the wood supply with such efficiency that William revised his estimate of their fuel consumption twice. He carried water from the indoor reserve without being asked. He helped Clara keep track of the supply inventory as items were consumed, updating the list she'd started before the storm in handwriting that was less neat than his sister's, but faster. He checked on Samuel every hour with the methodical consistency of someone who had been given a duty and intended to execute it without reminder. And he watched William, not in an uncomfortable way, in the way William had seen described that Thomas-specific attention, the way a boy watched a man when what he was really trying to do was learn how to be one. Clara, meanwhile, had discovered that the storm had created a problem with the water supply that no one else had caught yet. She brought it to William on the second day during a brief lull in the wind, holding her inventory list and pointing at a number with the calm authority of someone who had checked it 3 times before mentioning it. "The reserve barrel in the back room," she said. "We're using it faster than I estimated. If the storm goes 4 days instead of 3, we'll be short." William looked at the list, at the number. "You're right. There's snow," Clara said. "I know we can melt it, but it takes wood to melt it, and wood is also a limited resource right now." "Yes." He looked at the window where the snow was packing against the glass in a way that had a specific texture he'd learned to read. "The storm is going to break sometime tomorrow night, maybe sooner. But if it doesn't, then we melt snow and we're conservative with wood and we get through it." He looked at her. "This isn't our first tight calculation, Clara." She looked at the list. "No," she said in a tone that made him think she was agreeing with something larger than the literal statement. "I reckon not." The word reckon in a 9-year-old's voice with complete sincerity and no affectation. He almost smiled. The moment he almost smiled, Evelyn came through the kitchen door from the back room, and she caught the expression before he'd fully controlled it, and she did not say anything about it, but she saw it. He knew she saw it because she looked away in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental. The nights were the hardest. Not because of the cold or the wind or the logistics of the storm. Those things were manageable. The nights were the hardest because the house was small against the storm, and the darkness and the particular intimacy of people who had no space from each other forced a kind of honesty that daylight and work could normally prevent. On the second night, Samuel had a nightmare. William heard it through the wall. A sound that started as quiet crying and escalated in the way of a 5-year-old's distress, which had no particular concern for volume or self-consciousness. He heard Evelyn go to him immediately, and he heard her voice, low and steady. The sound of her, not the words, and then the crying subsided, and there was silence. He lay awake for a while longer. In the morning, Samuel was entirely himself eating his breakfast, asking Pete Aldrich why horses couldn't wear hats in winter, carrying biscuit from room to room with the determination of someone fulfilling a caregiving responsibility. The nightmare left no visible trace, but William looked at Evelyn across the breakfast table, and she was moving carefully in a way that told him she'd been up for a large portion of the night, and she looked at him and something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged in words. A kind of mutual recognition, an understanding that there were things happening in this house that went well below the surface of the working arrangement they'd agreed to. He poured her coffee and set it at her place before she got to the table. She sat down, looked at the cup, and then looked at him. "Thank you," she said. 6 degrees colder last night, he said. "Storm's losing pressure. Should start to break by tonight." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Good," she said. He went out for the morning barn run. The barn run on the second morning of the storm was when it happened. He was on the rope line, moving from the house to the barn, in snow so thick and wind so hard that he couldn't see more than 4 feet in any direction when the rope went slack. He stopped immediately. Felt along the line with his hands. The rope had come free from its fixing point at the barn end. The hook had pulled out of the wood, and the wind had driven the free end somewhere to his left, which was not the direction of the barn. He was approximately 15 feet from the barn door. In a whiteout, 15 feet was enough to get a man turned around and walking the wrong direction and not knowing it until it was too late. He stood still, controlled his breathing, told himself to think. He knew where the barn was. He knew the angle of the rope line from the house, knew roughly how far he'd come. He turned his body to the angle he was confident in and walked forward with his arms out, and 6 steps later his hand hit the barn door and he pulled it open and got inside. He stood in the barn for a moment with his heart working harder than normal. The animals were fine. The mare he'd been treating looked better, actually calmer than she'd been in days. He did what he needed to do, resecured the rope line to a different point on the barn exterior, a sturdier one, and went back to the house. He came through the kitchen door and Evelyn turned from the stove and looked at his face and put the spoon down. "What happened?" she said. "Rope line came loose," he said. She stared at him. "I'm fine," he said. "William." It was the first time she had used his given name. Neither of them missed it. "Sit down." "I don't need to." "You're shaking," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. She came to the table and she did something that nobody had done in 8 years. She took his hands, both of them, and held them in hers. And she looked at his face with the specific focused attention of someone checking for damage. His hands were cold. She held them anyway. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The fire in the stove made the sounds fires made. The wind pushed at the house. After a moment he said, "I'm all right." "I know you are," she said. "I can see that you are." But she didn't let go of his hands. He looked at her face, at the worry in it, real, uncomplicated, not performed. The kind of worry that a person had when something mattered to them and they weren't thinking about whether to show it. "The rope should have held," he said. "I should have checked the anchor point." "Yes," she said, "you should have. And next time you will. And that's the end of the self-recrimination, because you're here and you're all right, and self-recrimination in a storm is a waste of heat." He almost laughed. He actually laughed. It was a brief thing, rusty with disuse, but genuine, a short sound that startled him more than it seemed to startle her, and she looked at him with something shifting in her expression, something that had not been there before. "There it is," she said quietly. He looked at her. She let go of his hands. She went back to the stove. He sat at the table for another moment, looking at his own hands, which were still carrying the warmth of hers, in some way he could not make purely physical sense of. Then Roy came through from the back, and Pete was behind him, and Thomas appeared from somewhere, and the morning picked back up, and there was work, and there was noise, and there was the ordinary business of the storm, and whatever had happened at the kitchen table retreated into the regular current of the day. But it had happened. That was the thing about moments, the happening of them was permanent even when everything else moved on. The storm broke on the third night exactly as William had predicted. He was awake when it happened, when the wind lost its character, when the howling that had been constant for 2.5 days dropped suddenly to a sound more like breathing, and then to something quieter than that. He lay in his room and felt the change in the pressure and knew it. He got up, went to the window. The snow was still falling, but straight down now, no wind behind it, and through it, he could see the faint shapes of the barn and the fence line. He stood at the window for a long time. The house was quiet around him. Everyone sleeping. The particular quality of inhabited quiet, different from the empty quiet of before, from the silence that had lived in this house for years, like a second resident occupying space and exerting weight. He could hear, if he paid attention, the small sounds of other people resting. The creak of a floorboard from the storage room where Evelyn and the children slept. The distant suggestion of Biscuit the cat moving somewhere in the back room with the self-important silence of cats who believed they were undetected. He thought about Evelyn's hands around his. He thought about her voice saying his name, not Mr. Carter, but William, the one word that had arrived and landed differently than anything else in recent memory. He thought about the laugh that had come out of him. How strange it had felt. How long it had been. He put his hand flat on the window glass and felt the cold on the other side and the warmth on this side, the thin pain, the only thing between them. In the morning, he would check the damage. He would assess the cattle check. The fences calculate what needed to be repaired and in what order. He would do all of that with the same systematic clarity he brought to everything. But right now, in the dark, in the quiet, standing at the window of a house that sounded different than it had sounded 3 weeks ago, William Carter permitted himself one true thing. He was glad the gate had been open. He had not planned to be. He had not wanted to be. He had spent considerable energy in the days after their arrival, convincing himself that this was a transaction, a practical arrangement, a temporary solution to a specific operational need. But the gate had been open, and they had come through it, and the house sounded like this now, like people like breathing, like the small continuous proof that existence was not entirely solitary. He was glad. He pressed his hand harder against the glass, feeling the cold, and then let it go. He went back to bed. Outside, the snow fell soft and straight, and the storm was finished, and in the morning the valley of Caldwell Creek would wake to the specific silence that followed hard weather, and there would be damage to assess and work to do, and fences to check and animals to care for, and accounts to balance, and a 9-year-old who would have a revised inventory list ready before breakfast. He closed his eyes. He slept. And in the storage room across the kitchen, Evelyn Brooks lay awake, a little while longer. Her children sleeping around her, one hand pressed flat to the wall, as if she could feel the particular warmth of the house on the other side of it, a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove, and everything to do with the man who had kept it burning through the worst of the cold. She closed her eyes eventually, too. The storm was over. What came next would be something else entirely. The morning after the storm broke, Caldwell Creek looked like a town that had survived something and wasn't entirely sure yet whether to be relieved or afraid. William rode in on the 4th day after the storm once the roads were passable enough to make the trip worth the effort. He needed to assess the damage to the community check on supply routes and find out who'd been hit hardest by the blizzard. That was the kind of thing a man in his position did not, out of sentimentality, but out of the practical understanding that a valley was an ecosystem, and what damaged one part of it damaged all of it eventually. Roy came with him. Thomas asked to come, and William said yes because the boy had earned it, and because there were things a man learned about a community by riding through it after hard weather that could not be taught any other way. They rode 3 abreast into town, and William watched Thomas take it in the damaged rooftops. The fences down the particular expressions on people's faces that said they'd been scared, and were now converting that fear into work, which was the only productive thing you could do with it. Gerald Marsh was outside the trading post when they arrived, clearing snow from the entrance, with a determination that suggested he'd been at it for some time. "Carter," Marsh said, "you make it through all right." "Fine," William said, dismounting. "What's the damage in town?" Marsh leaned on the shovel. "Henderson's lost their roof on the east side. Widow Paulson's well is frozen solid. Jim Carey's been hauling water for her since yesterday morning. Abbott's lost 2 head of cattle in the north pasture." He paused. "Lawson came through fine, of course. Man's got the luck of the devil and the infrastructure to match." "Who needs the most help?" Marsh looked at him. "You're asking who needs help?" "I'm asking who needs help," William said evenly. Marsh nodded slowly. "Henderson. He's got 4 children and a wife who's been sick since November, and now half his roof is open to the sky." William looked at Roy. Roy looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at William. "All right," William said. "Let's go see Henderson." They were on their way back across the main street when Henry Lawson stepped out of the dry goods store and stopped on the boardwalk, taking in the sight of William Carter and his ranch hand, and a 13-year-old boy he did not recognize, and arranged his face into the expression he used when he was calculating something. "Carter," Lawson said, "heard you came through the storm without losses." "We did," William said, not stopping. "That widow woman manage all right." The way he said widow woman, the slight pause before it, the way it sat in his mouth carried everything he intended it to carry. William stopped. He turned. He looked at Henry Lawson on his boardwalk with his dry goods and his fine coat and his calculating eyes, and he said in a voice that was completely level, "Mrs. Brooks managed the household, the food supply, the storm inventory, and 3 children without a single moment of difficulty. She also identified a water supply problem on the second day that I had not yet caught. So yes, she managed all right." Lawson held his gaze for a moment. "No offense intended, Bill." "None taken," William said in a tone that communicated the opposite. He turned back and kept walking, Thomas falling into step beside him immediately. After a moment, Thomas said quietly, "Thank you for that." William didn't answer, but he heard it. They spent 4 hours at the Henderson place. Roy and Thomas worked the roof alongside the Henderson men, Bill Henderson himself and his 2 older sons, while William assessed the structural damage and made a list of what was needed. It was real damage, the kind that couldn't wait for spring, and William told Henderson straight that Silver Creek could supply lumber and 2 days of labor to get it weather-tight before the next system came through. Henderson was a proud man. William could see the cost of accepting the offer written on his face. "I'll pay you back in spring," Henderson said. "You'll help someone else in spring," William said. "That's how it works." Henderson looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Something in the nod, not gratitude exactly, but something closer to the recognition between men who understood the same set of rules. On the ride back, Thomas was quiet for a long stretch of road. Then he said, "Is that how it always works, in a community like this?" "It's how it's supposed to work," William said. "But it doesn't always." "No, it doesn't always." Thomas looked at the road ahead. "Lawson doesn't work that way. Lawson works the way men work when they've had enough for long enough that they've forgotten what it felt like to need something." Thomas thought about that. "My father always said that was the most dangerous kind of man. Not a cruel one, a comfortable one who'd lost his memory." William looked at him sideways. Daniel Brooks, he thought. Every day the man impressed him from the grave. They got back to the ranch at dusk, and the kitchen smelled like roasted meat and something with apples in it, and Samuel was standing on a chair at the counter next to Evelyn with flour on his face and an expression of profound self-satisfaction, and Biscuit, the cat, was sitting on the windowsill watching the whole operation with judicial detachment. "We made pie," Samuel announced. "We attempted pie," Evelyn said without turning from the stove. "The jury is still out on the result." "It smells like pie," Pete Aldrich said, hopefully coming in from the back room. "Smells and results are different things," Clara said from the table without looking up from the book she was reading. It was in fact pie, a credible one. The crust was slightly thick on one side, and when Samuel was asked about this, he explained that he had been in charge of that particular section and he had wanted it to be sturdy, which was a reasonable, creative decision, and nobody argued with him. William ate 2 pieces. He did not comment on this. Nobody at the table mentioned it. But he caught Evelyn watching him from across the table with something quiet and warm in her expression, and he looked away first. 3 days after the storm ended, the first letter arrived. Gerald Marsh brought it out himself, which was unusual enough to signal that he knew something about what was in it. He handed it to William on the porch with the careful neutrality of a man delivering something he'd already read over in his head and formed opinions about. It was addressed to Evelyn Brooks, care of Silver Creek Ranch. William took it inside and gave it to her without looking at it any further, and she took it and looked at the handwriting on the front and went very still. "Do you know who it's from?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "My husband's brother, Harold." She turned the envelope in her hands. "He's been looking for us." William said nothing. Waited. She opened it. He watched her read it. He watched her face, which he had learned over the past weeks to read in the careful sideways way he'd learned to read most things, not intrusively, but attentively. The way you watched weather. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and pressed her hand flat on top of it, and she looked at the wall for a moment. "He wants us to come to Ohio," she said. "He has a house, room for us." She paused. "He says he can take Thomas on in his business. He says the girls would be fine in the local school." She stopped. "He says it's not right for a woman in my position to be working for a man she doesn't know." The kitchen was very quiet. He says, she continued, her voice taking on a quality that was careful and controlled, that my situation reflects poorly on Daniel's family. William looked at her hand still pressed flat on the letter. What are you going to do? He said. She looked up at him. I don't know yet. All right, he said. He picked up his coat. William. She said his name the same way she'd said it during the storm, without decision, without ceremony, just the name. He stopped. It's not that the offer is kind. Harold means well, he always has. It's just that... She stopped. Started again. In Ohio, we would be Harold's obligation. We would be the widow and the children that Harold took in. That's what we'd be for the rest of the time we were there, however long that was. She looked at the letter. Here we work. Here we contribute. Thomas splits posts and manages livestock. Clara does the accounts. I run the kitchen. Samuel? She almost smiled. Samuel names the animals and asks the questions nobody else asks. We are useful here. We are not... She pressed the letter harder. We are not someone's burden here. He stood with his coat half on. No, he said. You're not. She looked at him steadily. Then I need to know something. What? Whether this is still temporary in your mind. Whether at the end of winter, when you sell and you have wages to pay, we are going to be the people you thank and send on their way. I need to know that now before I write back to Harold. Because if that's the shape of this, I'll go to Ohio. It isn't what I want, but it's stable, and stability is what my children need. The most important question a person had asked him in a decade, delivered in a kitchen that smelled like pie on a Tuesday morning in December. He looked at her. It's not temporary, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. Then I'll write to Harold. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the stove. William put his coat the rest of the way on and went out to the barn. Roy was checking the bay gelding's shoes when William came in, and he looked up once and went back to what he was doing. Evelyn got a letter, William said, from her husband's brother. Wants her to come to Ohio. Roy said, in the tone he used when he already knew what the outcome of a situation was going to be. She's staying, William said. Roy set the gelding's foot down and straightened. Yes, he said. I know. William looked at him. How'd you know? Roy picked up his brush. Because she's been re-seasoning your pans and fixing your breadboard and reorganizing your larder for 3 weeks, and a woman who's planning to leave doesn't put that kind of work into someone else's kitchen. He paused. And because that boy of hers has been working your land like it's already his responsibility, and he's not the kind of child who does that for something temporary. William was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this a while, he said. Since day 3, Roy said. William picked up a saddle blanket that didn't need straightening and straightened it anyway. Mind your own work, Roy. Yes, sir, Roy said in the tone that meant he was done saying what he had to say, and was satisfied with how it had landed. The second major problem arrived not from Ohio, but from town. It came in the form of 3 men on horseback who rode onto Silver Creek property on a Thursday afternoon, when William was in the south field and Evelyn was alone in the house with the children. Roy and Pete were in the far barn. Thomas was in the yard. He saw them come through the gate, and he stood his ground in the way that 13-year-olds stood their ground when they were trying to be larger than they were, which was to say, chin-up hands, visible feet planted. The man who rode in front was someone Thomas hadn't seen before. Big, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that was better quality than his manners suggested. He looked at the house, looked at Thomas, and said, "Where's Carter?" "South Field," Thomas said. "Can I help you?" "Not likely, boy. Go get him." Thomas didn't move. "I can take a message." The man looked at him with the particular expression that men who were accustomed to being obeyed wore when they encountered someone who hadn't received the instruction. "I said go get him." "And I said I can take a message," Thomas said levelly. "Mr. Carter is working. I'm not going to pull him from work for something I don't have information about." The man started to speak again. Evelyn came out of the front door. She had a kitchen towel in her hand and flour on her forearms, and she walked out onto the porch with the same energy she brought to everything, direct, unhurried, taking up exactly as much space as the situation required. "Good afternoon," she said. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The man on the horse looked her over in a way that had an opinion in it. "Ma'am, we're here to see Carter on a business matter. I'm Mrs. Brooks. I manage the household at Silver Creek." She said it completely calmly, as if this were an established and uncontested fact. "Mr. Carter is in the south field. If your business is urgent, I can send someone for him. If it can wait, he'll be back by 4 o'clock. "It's about the north grazing boundary," the man said. "Lawson's been talking about Carter's fence line running 6 feet onto property that ain't his." Evelyn looked at him. "Mr. Carter's fence lines were surveyed and established in 1874. I've seen the documentation in the household records. If Mr. Lawson has concerns about a boundary, the appropriate channel would be the county surveyor's office, not an unannounced visit on a Thursday afternoon." She paused pleasantly. "Was there anything else?" The man stared at her. Then he looked at the man behind him. Then back at Evelyn. "Tell Carter we'll be in touch," he said. "Of course," Evelyn said. "Good afternoon." They turned and rode out. Thomas turned to look at Evelyn. She let out one long breath slowly through her nose. "Did you know that?" Thomas said. "About the survey records." "I read the household files in the first week," she said. "You never know what's going to be relevant." She looked at him. "You held your ground." "You held it better," he said. "Yes," she said. "But you held yours first." She looked at where the men had gone. "Go find Mr. Carter. He should know about this before tonight." Thomas was already moving. When William heard what had happened, Thomas delivering the account with the precision of someone who understood that accuracy mattered. In these situations, he stood in the south field for a moment, looking north toward the Lawson property. The fence line issue was not new. There had been a quiet disagreement about the north boundary for 2 years, and William had always known Lawson would escalate it eventually. He had not anticipated Evelyn being the one to meet that escalation. He had not anticipated a great many things that had happened in the past month. "She cited the survey records," Thomas said. "I heard you the first time," William said. "She read the household files in the first week," Thomas said. "She said you never know what's going to be relevant." William started walking back toward the house. "She knew more about your ranch boundaries than those men did," Thomas said, keeping pace. "They didn't expect that." "No," William said. "I don't imagine they did." "Mr. Carter." "What?" Thomas kept walking for a step or two before he said it. "My father always said a woman who was competent in a crisis was worth more than any amount of comfortable weather." He paused. "I think he'd have liked her. Evelyn. I mean, obviously he did. But I think he'd have liked the way she is here. The way she's become." William said nothing, but it sat in him what the boy had said. Sat in a place that had been empty for years, and was learning slowly and without ceremony to hold weight again. He went to the house, went directly to the files, pulled out the survey documentation, and spent an hour reviewing it. Evelyn sat across the table from him with her mending, and answered questions when he had them, which was 4 times. And each time she pulled the answer out of her memory with the offhand precision of someone who had read something once and filed it away in a mind that did not lose things. "You memorized the survey boundary markers," he said on the 4th answer. "I retained them," she said. "There's a difference. I don't make an effort to memorize things. I just pay attention." He looked at her over the papers. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She went back to her mending. He went back to the survey. But something in the room had shifted in the way things shifted in that house now, quietly, incrementally. The way ice became water. No single moment you could point to, just the accumulated evidence of a transformation already underway. It was Clara who first noticed something was wrong with the Hendersons. She came to William 4 days after their visit to town on a Saturday morning, and she stood in the doorway of the room he used as an office, and she said, "I heard something at Marcia's store when Mama took me with her yesterday." William looked up from the accounts. "Mrs. Henderson isn't sick from the cold," Clara said. "She's sick from something else. Something they're not saying directly. And Mr. Henderson didn't just lose 2 cattle in the storm. He lost more than that. Gerald Marsh told someone he thought Henderson might lose the whole operation by spring if he couldn't get ahead of his debts." William set his pen down. "Who told you this?" he said. "Nobody told me. I was standing next to the flour barrel and nobody thought I was paying attention." She held his gaze. "I'm always paying attention." He looked at the 9-year-old in his doorway and thought not for the first time about the particular unfairness of a world that had given this child so much native intelligence and so few resources to deploy it with. "Thank you," he said. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But knowing is better than not knowing. You were right to tell me." She nodded once satisfied and left. The Henderson situation had to be handled carefully. Bill Henderson was a proud man William had established that on the first visit and pride mismanaged could turn assistance into humiliation, which was worse than no assistance at all. William turned the problem over for 2 days before he arrived at an approach. He went to see Henderson on a Monday. He didn't bring anyone with him this time. Henderson was in his repaired barn when William arrived, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had been spending considerable time alone with his own thoughts and had not found the experience particularly restorative. "Carter," he said. "Henderson." William looked at the barn, at the new boards on the roof section they'd repaired. "Work held up fine." "It did. I'm grateful about that." William leaned against the stall door. "I've been looking at my operations needs for spring. I'm going to be short on hands for the early cattle work. Pete's thinking about moving on west, got family out in Oregon Territory he wants to get back to. Roy can't do it alone, and I can't be in 3 places at once." Henderson looked at him. "You saying you need a hired hand?" "I'm saying I'd like to talk to you about a working arrangement. One where you and your boys put in a day a week at Silver Creek starting in February in exchange for a share of the spring cattle proceeds." He met Henderson's eyes. "Not charity. A business arrangement. One that happens to benefit both operations." Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "My wife," he said. "She's—" "I know," William said quietly. "Clara overheard something in town. I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm asking if the arrangement makes sense." Henderson looked at the barn floor. "Why would you do this?" "Because a valley is a community," William said. "Because in 3 months, you might have something I need, and I'd rather know now whether you're the kind of man who can work it both directions." He paused. "And because I've had some recent education about what it looks like when people who need help won't accept it, and I didn't much like what I saw." Henderson looked at him. "Myself," William said before Henderson could ask. "I was talking about myself." Something shifted in Henderson's face. The pride didn't disappear, but it moved over slightly, made room for something else. "All right," Henderson said. "Let's talk terms." It was on the ride back from Henderson's place that William encountered Lawson again. This time, Lawson was not alone. He had 2 men with him, and they were stopped on the road at the approximate point where the Silver Creek north boundary met the open range, and Lawson was standing at the fence line with a measuring rope in his hand. William rode up and stopped. "Lawson." "Carter." Lawson looked at the fence. "I've had this line remeasured." "By who?" "My own man." "Your own man measured your dispute with me." "He's a qualified surveyor." "I'm sure he is," William said. "I have the county survey from 1874. I'm happy to present it to the county office if you'd like to make this official." Lawson looked at him. "No need to get official about it." "Then why are you standing at my fence line with a measuring rope?" Lawson let the rope drop slightly. He had the expression of a man who had anticipated a different kind of resistance and was recalibrating. "I'm simply keeping track of my interests." "Keep track of them on your side of the fence," William said. "I'll keep track of mine on mine. And if you send men to my property again when I'm not present, I'd appreciate them having the courtesy to wait outside the gate." Lawson's jaw tightened. Those men had a legitimate message to deliver. They delivered it to a woman alone with 3 children. There are ways to do that, and ways not to. William held his gaze for a moment. "The next time you have business at Silver Creek Lawson, you bring it to me directly. That's how this is going to work." Lawson looked at him for a long time. "I didn't expect that woman to change the way you operate," he said finally, and there was something in it that was not quite respect, but was in the same county. "She didn't change the way I operate," William said. "She showed me how I was already operating before I decided to admit it." He rode on. Lawson didn't follow. The piece William had not anticipated was the children's effect on him in accumulation. Individually, he had calibrated himself to each of them to Thomas's wordless competence, and his watching to Clara's sharp mind, and her accountant's eye for the world, to Samuel's spectacular lack of concern for the ordinary rules of human interaction. He had calibrated himself to each of those things separately, and believed he was managing them adequately. What he had not accounted for was what all 3 of them did together in the evenings in his house. On Friday nights, Evelyn had established a habit, unannounced, unplanned, simply occurring, of reading aloud after supper. She had a book she'd carried from Nebraska, a collection of stories, and she read from it for 45 minutes or so, while the fire held, and the lamps burned, and the ranch settled around them. William had not intended to stay for this. The first Friday, he had been finishing something at his desk, and had simply not left before it started. The second Friday, he had come in from the evening check and sat down at the table for what he told himself was a cup of coffee, and by the time he'd finished the coffee, the reading was over. The third Friday, he sat down before the coffee was poured, and stayed until Samuel fell asleep with his head on William's arm. The child had simply leaned against him at some point in the reading, and then listed gradually sideways until he was no longer upright, and William had sat very still and not moved, because the weight of a sleeping 5-year-old on his arm was not something you disrupted lightly, and also, if he was honest, and he was trying to be, because something about the weight of it was the most specific and complete comfort he had experienced in a very long time. Thomas noticed. Thomas was looking at him from across the table with those gray eyes, and he didn't say anything, which was sometimes more significant than the things he said. Clara had fallen asleep in her chair. Evelyn had closed the book. She looked at Samuel on William's arm, and then at William. "I'll take him," she said softly. "He's fine," William said. She looked at him for a moment. Sitting there in the firelight with her sleeping boy against his side, and her older children worn out around the table, and the ranch quiet outside, and the man who had almost shut the gate on all of them, holding the smallest of them, with the careful stillness of someone who had been trusted with something fragile. She looked at him, and she did not say the thing that was in her face to say. Instead, she said, "Good night, William." "Good night," he said. She woke Clara gently and steered her toward the storage room, and Thomas unfolded himself from his chair and said, "Good night, sir," with something in his voice that was quiet and full, and then it was just William and Samuel and the dying fire. William sat there for a long while. He looked at the boy's face, 5 years old, entirely peaceful. The oversized coat long since exchanged for something that fit the frost gone from his lashes, home in a way that children could become home somewhere with a speed that adults had lost the capacity for. He thought about what he had said to Evelyn 3 weeks into this. It's not temporary. He had meant it when he said it in the practical transactional way a man of his nature meant things when he said them. The arrangement would continue. The Brooks family would stay through spring, and then they would discuss what came next. That was what he had meant. But sitting in his kitchen with a sleeping child against his arm, and the particular warmth of a house that held other people, he understood quietly without drama, with the same matter-of-fact precision he brought to a fence survey or a cattle count, that what he had meant and what was actually happening had become 2 very different things and had been diverging for some time without his permission. He was not managing a working arrangement. He was part of a family. He didn't know what to do with that. He sat with it the way he sat with hard things, steadily without flinching, letting it exist, without demanding it resolve itself immediately. Samuel sighed in his sleep, adjusted his position slightly, and settled back. William put his free hand on the table and looked at it. The roughness of it. The work in it. 15 years of this land in the lines of his palm. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear and enormous. Inside, the fire burned low, and Henry Lawson was still standing at the fence line with his measuring rope, and Harold Brooks was still waiting in Ohio for an answer, and the North boundary dispute was unresolved, and the Henderson situation was only partially addressed, and there were 100 things still moving in directions William could not fully see. But Samuel was asleep on his arm. And for the moment, that was the only fact that required his full attention. Harold Brooks arrived on a Wednesday. Nobody had warned William. That was the first thing. He came in a hired wagon from the Caldwell Creek station, a man of perhaps 50, with Daniel Brooks's jaw, and none of Daniel Brooks's apparent character, wearing a coat that said Ohio money, and carrying an expression that said he had already decided everything he needed to decide before the wagon stopped moving. William was in the yard when the wagon came through the gate through his gate, which the driver had opened without asking, and Harold Brooks climbed down and looked at Silver Creek Ranch with the evaluative eyes of a man pricing something he intended to acquire. "You must be Carter," Harold said. "I am," William said. "Harold Brooks, Daniel's brother." He extended his hand. William shook it. The shake was firm in the competitive way of men who used handshakes to establish something. "I wrote to Evelyn. She didn't write back." "She mentioned she was thinking about her response," William said. "Thinking took long enough that I decided to come see the situation for myself." Harold looked at the house. "She inside?" "She is." "I'd like to speak with her." "I expect she'll want to speak with you too," William said. "Come in." He said it the way he said everything, evenly, without warmth or hostility, simply as a fact. But he walked ahead of Harold Brooks into his own house, and he held the door in a way that was hospitable, and also, without being obvious about it, a reminder of whose door it was. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with Clara working through the weekly accounts. She looked up when they came in, and William watched her face do something complicated. A flash of surprise, a rapid recalibration, and then a stillness that he had come to recognize as Evelyn Brooks, deciding who she was going to be in a situation before the situation had fully arrived. She stood. "Harold," she said. "Evelyn." He looked at her, then at Clara, who was looking at him with the frank, unblinking assessment she applied to everything. "This must be Clara." "Yes," Clara said. She did not smile. She was taking inventory of this man, the way she took inventory of everything, and Harold Brooks was apparently not coming out ahead. "Where are the boys?" Harold asked. "Thomas is in the barn. Samuel is—" Evelyn looked around. "Somewhere educational, I'm sure." She looked at William. "Could you give us a few minutes?" "Of course," William said. He went to the barn. He found Thomas there, which he had known he would, and the boy looked up from the harness he was oiling and read William's expression with the accuracy he always brought to reading William's expressions. "Who came?" Thomas said. "Your Uncle Harold." Thomas set the harness down slowly. "He came himself." "He did." Thomas looked at the barn door. "He wants us to go to Ohio." "He wants to talk to your mother." "That's the same thing." Thomas stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, with the deliberate movements of someone controlling a reaction he hadn't decided how to express yet. "He wrote 2 letters. Mama didn't answer either one." "I know. She didn't answer because she'd already decided." Thomas looked at William directly. "Hadn't she?" It was not entirely a question. "You'd have to ask her," William said. "I'm asking you." William met the boy's eyes. 13 years old, standing in a barn in Montana, asking a man he'd known for 6 weeks, a question that was really 3 or 4 questions underneath the one on the surface. "I told your mother this arrangement wasn't temporary," William said. "That was true when I said it. It's still true." Thomas absorbed this. nodded once the way he nodded when something confirmed what he'd already believed. "All right," he said. He picked the harness back up. "I'll be in here if anybody needs me." William went to find Samuel, which took less time than expected because Samuel was sitting on the porch steps with Biscuit and a stick he was using to draw something in the dirt, and he looked up when William came around the corner and said, "Uncle Harold is here. He smells like train smoke and decisions." William crouched down to the boy's level. "How do you know about decisions?" he said. "Mama says some people walk into a room carrying decisions like luggage," Samuel said. "She says you can tell because they don't look around. They just look for where to put the bag down." He tilted his head. Uncle Harold didn't look around. William looked at the drawing in the dirt. It appeared to be a horse rendered with surprising accuracy for a 5-year-old working with a stick. "Samuel," he said, "you know this is your home." Samuel looked at him. "I know," he said simply, as if this were a fact that had never been in question. "All right," William said. He stood up and went back inside. Harold Brooks was still in the kitchen, sitting at the table now across from Evelyn. Clara had apparently been removed from the room, or had removed herself, which was more likely because it was just the two of them. And the quality of the conversation William walked into was the quality of a conversation that had already established its positions and was in the process of defending them. "It isn't proper," Harold was saying in the tone of a man who believed tone was persuasion. "A woman alone working in a man's house, sleeping under his roof." "I'm not alone," Evelyn said. "I have 3 children with me." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." "Tell me what you mean then, plainly." Harold looked at William when he came in. Something in the look carried an appeal. "Man to man," the look said. "Help me make her see sense." William pulled out a chair and sat down and offered Harold nothing. "What I mean," Harold said carefully, "is that people are talking, in town, about the situation here. A widow living in a single man's home. It creates an impression, Evelyn." "What impression?" Evelyn said. "You know what impression." "I'd like you to say it." Harold's jaw tightened. "It reflects on Daniel's memory. It reflects on the family." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at her brother-in-law for a long moment. "Harold," she said, "Daniel has been gone for 4 months. His children were sleeping in a wagon in December in Montana because we had nowhere else to go. The bank took the farm. I had no money, no family within 1,000 miles, and 3 children who needed to eat." She paused. "I found work. Legitimate, decent work in a household that has treated us with nothing but respect. I kept my children fed and warm and safe through one of the worst blizzards this valley has seen in a decade." She folded her hands on the table. "If that reflects poorly on Daniel's memory, then Daniel would be the first to tell you that your memory of him is wrong." Harold opened his mouth. "My husband," Evelyn said quietly, with a precision that cut off whatever Harold had been going to say, "would have done exactly what I did. He would have found the work. He would have kept the children fed. He would have had the dignity to accept help from a good man when it was offered in good faith. And he would have been profoundly uninterested in what the town of Caldwell Creek thought about his choices." She looked at Harold steadily. "I am my husband's wife. That is how I am living." Harold sat back. He looked at Evelyn for a moment, then at William, then at his own hands. "The offer stands," he said finally. "Ohio, a home, stability." "I know," Evelyn said, "and I'm grateful for it, genuinely." Her voice softened just slightly. "I know you mean well, Harold. I know you're trying to do right by Daniel, but we are doing right by Daniel here too. We are working. We are building something. My children are—" She stopped. "My children are becoming who they're going to be here. I'm not going to interrupt that to go be someone's obligation in Ohio." Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He would have liked you to have people around you." "I have people around me," Evelyn said. Harold looked at William. William met his gaze and said nothing, and let Evelyn's words occupy the space in the room the way they deserved to. Harold Brooks left the next morning. He ate supper with them the night he arrived, a quieter version of himself, watching the table with the eyes of a man recalibrating, and he ruffled Samuel's hair when the boy asked him 17 questions about Ohio, and he spoke to Thomas for a long time after the meal quietly in the corner of the room, and whatever he said made Thomas stand straighter when it was over. Before he got into the hired wagon in the morning, he stopped in front of William. "I don't know you," Harold said. "No," William agreed. "But I know what I saw at that table last night. I know what I saw with those children." He looked at the house, then back at William. "Daniel would have shaken your hand." "I'd have been glad to shake it," William said. Harold nodded. He climbed into the wagon. He did not look back as it went down the lane, but just before it turned onto the road, he raised one hand. William raised his in return. Roy, who had witnessed this from the bunkhouse door, waited until the wagon was gone and then said, "That go better than expected." "Yes," William said. "Good," Roy said. He went back inside. The boundary dispute with Lawson came to a head 10 days later, and it came the way William had expected it to come, not through honest confrontation, but through paperwork. A letter arrived from a Billings attorney named Caldwell, representing Henry Lawson, claiming that the north fence line of Silver Creek Ranch encroached on Lawson's property by 11 feet along a quarter-mile stretch, and requesting that Carter either move the fence or negotiate compensation. William read the letter twice. He set it on the table. Clara, who had been doing her homework at the other end of the table and had the peripheral vision of a hawk, said, "Is that the Lawson letter?" He looked at her. "How do you know about the Lawson situation?" "Thomas told me, and I read the survey notes when you left them out last week." She waited. "Is it bad?" "It's a legal claim," William said, "which means it has to be answered legally." "Do you have a lawyer?" "I know a man in Helena, used him twice before." "Is he good?" William looked at the 9-year-old across the table. "He's adequate." Clara frowned slightly. "Adequate isn't good enough for Lawson if Lawson has a Billings attorney." He looked at her. "Billings attorneys are more expensive than Helena attorneys," Clara said. "Which means Lawson is serious. Which means you need someone better than adequate." William picked up the letter again. "Do you happen to know a Billings attorney?" "No," Clara said. "But Gerald Marsh might. He knows everybody." She went back to her homework. William stared at the letter for another moment. Then he put on his coat and went to see Gerald Marsh. Gerald Marsh did in fact know a Billings attorney, a woman named Frances Alcott, who had moved to Montana from Chicago 5 years prior, and had, according to Marsh, won 7 out of 8 property disputes she'd taken on in the territory, and lost the 8th because her client had lied to her, which was not. Marsh said a reflection on her abilities. A woman attorney was unusual enough in 1881 Montana that William sat with the information for a day before he wrote the letter to her. Not because he doubted her capabilities. Clara's logic on the subject of Billings attorneys had been entirely sound, but because he was aware that engaging a woman attorney would itself be a statement in a valley that watched William Carter's decisions and formed opinions about them, and he wanted to be sure he was making the statement deliberately, rather than accidentally. He wrote the letter. He was deliberate about it. Frances Alcott wrote back in 4 days, which was fast, and her response was thorough and specific, and made no wasted gestures, which told him everything about her that he needed to know. She outlined the legal position, cited the relevant territorial statutes, and told him that the 1874 survey was sufficient to defend the claim if it had been properly registered with the county, which it had been. She also said in a postscript that he read twice, "The fact that Lawson employed a Billings firm suggests he is expecting this to be contested, which in turn suggests his own survey evidence is not as strong as the letter implies. Men with strong cases don't generally pay for expensive attorneys unless they expect a fight." "She's right," Evelyn said, reading over his shoulder. He had shown her the letter without quite deciding to the way he'd been doing things lately, simply finding that she was there, and that the natural motion of a thing included her. "I know," he said. "Are you going to hire her?" "Yes." Evelyn straightened. "Good." She went back to the stove. Then, Clara thought of it first. "I know that too," he said. He heard her smile in the silence. Didn't need to see it. The thing with the Henderson family happened on a Thursday, and it happened fast. William got word from Roy, who had heard it in town. Mrs. Henderson had taken a serious turn. The illness that had been vague and ongoing had declared itself in the night as something acute, and Bill Henderson had ridden for the doctor at 2 in the morning, and the doctor had come and gone twice, and the situation was not good. William told Evelyn. She was already untying her apron before he finished the sentence. "I'll need the wagon," she said. "I'll drive you." "You don't have to." "I'll drive you," he said. They went. Evelyn walked into the Henderson house with the particular quality of a woman who knew how to enter a crisis without adding to it quietly, quickly reading the room before she said a word. Henderson was at his wife's bedside. His 2 older sons were sitting at the kitchen table, looking like boys who had gone to bed as children and woken up as something else. His 2 younger daughters were with a neighbor woman in the corner. Evelyn spoke to the neighbor woman first, got the information she needed. Then she went to Bill Henderson. William stood in the doorway of the Henderson kitchen and watched her do this. Watched her speak to the neighbor, move to Henderson, say whatever she said to him in a low voice that made the man's shoulders drop about 2 inches from where they'd been braced. Watched her check the children in the corner and say something to each one individually. Watched her make a brief assessment of the kitchen and its supplies and begin to do things that needed doing. She was not demonstrating competence. She was just competent in the same automatic, unself-conscious way she was everything. Henderson's older son, the 17-year-old Will Jr., was watching Evelyn too. After a few minutes, he said to William quietly, "She do this a lot. Just walk into a bad situation and know what to do." "Yes," William said. Will Jr. nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Because Pa doesn't know what to do, and the rest of us are following Pa, and that's not working." They stayed 4 hours. Evelyn organized the household with the efficiency of someone who had managed 3 children through a blizzard. She was unruffled by the chaos, unfazed by the fear, simply present and useful, and moving forward. Henderson's wife was stabilized by the time the second doctor's visit came. Not recovered, not safe, but stabilized. On the drive home, William and Evelyn were quiet for a long time. The horses moved at their own pace. The road was cold and empty. The Montana sky was doing what the Montana sky did in January, being immense and dark and humbling. "She's going to be all right," Evelyn said finally. "I think, if she rests." "I think so too. Bill Henderson is a good man. He's just scared." "Fear makes men useless if they let it," William said. "Daniel was the same," she said not unkindly. "He was brave about almost everything. But with the children, when any of them were sick, he went completely to pieces. I'd find him in the barn talking to the horses because he didn't know what else to do with himself." "What did you do?" "I did what needed doing. And then afterward, when everything was fine, I let him be the one who'd been steady." She paused. "That's not dishonest. That's marriage." He drove the horses. "You were the strong one," he said. "We were both strong," she said. "Just in different ways. You learn after a while to cover for each other's specific weaknesses and let the other person cover yours." She turned her face toward him briefly in the dark. "It takes time, but you get good at it. At fitting." Fitting. He held that word in the cold air. "Evelyn," he said. "William." They were both quiet for a moment. The horses' feet on the frozen road. The dark around them. "I'm not a man who says things before he's sure of them," he said. "I know. So I won't say things yet." He kept his eyes on the road. "But I want you to know that I'm—" He stopped. "The picture of what I thought my life was going to be for the rest of my life. It's changed. In the past 6 weeks. It's changed considerably." She was quiet. "That's all I can say right now," he said. "That it's changed, and that I'm not afraid of that." The horses moved. After a long moment, Evelyn said, "Daniel used to say that the most honest thing a person could tell you was what they weren't afraid of. That courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the list of specific things you'd decided to stop running from. He looked at the road ahead. He was right, William said. Yes, she said. He usually was. They drove home in a silence that was the warmest silence William could remember inhabiting in many years. The legal response to Lawson arrived from Francis Alcott 3 weeks later, and it was a document of such precise and well-organized authority that even Roy Tillman, who had no particular interest in legal matters, read it twice and said, "Damn," at the end, which was as much as Roy generally said about anything. Francis Alcott had not only defended the 1874 survey, she had gone further. She had reviewed the county records and found that Lawson's property claim itself had a title irregularity from 1878, a period when Lawson had sold a partial interest to an investor who had subsequently failed to properly file the transfer, leaving the recorded boundary of Lawson's property in a state of technical ambiguity that Alcott laid out with the calm, devastating precision of a woman who had been underestimated in enough legal rooms to know exactly how to win in one. She was not attacking Lawson. She was simply pointing out with meticulous documentation that a man who lived in a glass house should consider his position before throwing stones. William read the letter at the kitchen table. Clara read it after him. "She's exceptional," Clara said. "She is," William agreed. "You should tell her that." "I will in my response." "Not in so many words," Clara said. "Just pay her what she's worth. That's how you tell a professional person they're exceptional." Thomas had read the letter by this point, leaning over Clara's shoulder. "What happens to Lawson now?" "He backs down, or he escalates," William said. "Escalating is expensive, and his case is weaker than he thought. My estimate is he backs down." "And if he doesn't?" William looked at his coffee cup. "Then Francis Alcott takes him apart in front of a judge, and he knows that, which is why I think he backs down." Thomas nodded, straightened. "Good," he said with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing adolescent in it. Roy came in from outside that afternoon, looking like a man who had something to say, and was deciding how to say it. He got his coffee, sat down, and looked at William. "Widow Paulson stopped me in town," Roy said. "Asked if it was true that Carter's woman had organized the Henderson household when Martha Henderson took ill." William set his cup down. "Carter's woman," he said. Roy looked at him steadily. "That's what she said. I'm reporting it accurately." "What did you say?" "I said Mrs. Brooks had been at the Henderson place and had been helpful, yes." Roy paused. "She said she reckoned Carter's woman was the best thing that had happened to this valley in 10 years. Then she said she'd been wrong to talk the way she had in the first weeks, when Mrs. Brooks arrived." The kitchen was quiet. "She wasn't the only one who talked," Roy said. "But she's the first one who said that second part. Figured you should know." William looked at his hands on the table. Then he stood and took his cup to the basin. "Thank you, Roy," he said. Roy went back outside, and William stood at the basin for a moment, looking out the window, thinking about the particular way the world shifted when it decided to not all at once, not dramatically, but in accumulations. Small corrections. People who had been wrong admitting it. The voice of a community finding its better register, one person at a time. He had not expected this valley to do that. He was glad it was. That evening, Evelyn made the apple cake she'd been saying she would make since the storm. She'd been waiting for the right moment, without saying so, and apparently the right moment was a Thursday in January, with the legal crisis resolved, and Harold back in Ohio, and Martha Henderson stabilizing, and Widow Paulson recanting in the middle of Caldwell Creek. The cake came out of the oven at 8 o'clock, and the smell of it moved through the house like something physical, and Samuel appeared from nowhere, in the way he always did when food was involved. And Clara came in from her reading without being called. And Thomas and Pete and Roy came from the bunkhouse at a pace that was faster than their normal pace, without anyone looking like they were hurrying. They ate it at the table, all 7 of them, and it was good. Genuinely good. The kind of thing that a person remembered the specific taste of for years afterward. William had a second piece. Samuel had 3. Roy said it was the best thing he'd eaten since 1876, and meant it. Clara said the brown sugar to apple ratio was correctly calibrated, which was the highest compliment she was constitutionally capable of delivering. Thomas said nothing, but ate his piece with an expression of thorough contentment. Evelyn watched the table with her hands around her coffee and the particular expression she wore sometimes in the evenings, when she thought no one was paying attention. Open, unguarded something in her that was almost wonder. At the fact of this table. At these people around it. At the specific, ordinary miracle of a warm house and good food and people you trusted within arm's reach. William was paying attention. He looked at her, looking at the table, and something settled in him. Not resolved, not complete, not yet, but settling like a foundation. Finding its level, like something that had been leaning toward a fall, deciding instead to stand. Lawson's response came 4 days later. It was brief, and for Lawson notably humble. He acknowledged the 1874 survey withdrew the boundary claim and suggested through his Billings attorney that any remaining neighborly disagreements could be addressed through conversation rather than legal channels. William read it. Set it down. Clara looked up from the table. "He backed down," she said. "He did." She went back to her work. Then, "I told you she was exceptional." "You did?" William agreed. "You were right." Clara had the grace not to look smug about it, but it was a near thing. William wrote 2 letters that afternoon, one to Frances Alcott, who received payment that reflected what her work was actually worth, and a line at the end that said simply, "Your postscript was the most useful thing in the correspondence." The second letter was to the county surveyor's office formally registering the boundary documentation in a way that would make any future dispute considerably harder to sustain. He sealed them, put them in the outgoing mail with Gerald Marsh, and came home to a kitchen that smelled like supper and sounded like people, and hung up his coat on the hook inside the door that had at some point in the past 7 weeks become his hook, the one everyone understood was his, without anyone having said so. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, Evelyn at the stove, Clara at the table with her books. Samuel cross-legged on the floor with Biscuit engaged in some kind of negotiation that the cat was clearly winning. Thomas's voice from the back room talking to Roy about something the cadence of it easy and familiar. 7 weeks. He had raised his hand to close that gate. He thought about that sometimes in the way you thought about the moments that had been close calls, not with fear, but with a kind of vertiginous gratitude, the recognition of how thin the margin had been between the life you almost lived and the one you were living. Samuel looked up from his negotiation with Biscuit. "Mr. Carter," he said. "What?" "I think you should sit down," Samuel said, with the authority he deployed for what he considered his most important observations. "You look like a man who's been carrying something and doesn't know he can put it down yet." The kitchen was suddenly very quiet. Evelyn's spoon stopped moving. Clara looked up. William looked at the 5-year-old on his floor. He pulled out his chair. He sat down. "Thank you, Samuel," he said. "You're welcome," Samuel said, and went back to the cat. And William Carter sat at his kitchen table in the house that no longer sounded empty and put the thing he'd been carrying down, and found that it was lighter than he'd expected, and that the table could hold it, and that the people around it didn't flinch under the weight. They just kept going, the way families did. February came in quietly, which William did not trust. Quiet in Montana in February was not peace. It was pause, the kind of pause that preceded something. And a man who had lived through enough of them learned to use the time well, rather than mistake it for permission to relax. He used it to work. The Henderson arrangement was running. Bill Henderson and his older boy came out 2 mornings a week and worked the cattle with Roy, and they were good workers, willing and efficient, and the operation ran smoother for it. Martha Henderson was recovering, slow but recovering. Every time William heard this from Marsh, or from Roy, or from Evelyn, who had continued to check on her, he felt something that he could only describe as the satisfaction of a correctly made decision, which was not a feeling he had experienced as often as he would have liked in the past 8 years. Frances Alcott had written once more since the Lawson matter closed, not about legal business, but to say that she had heard through the county network that the boundary dispute had resolved cleanly and that she hoped Silver Creek Ranch was faring well. It was a professional courtesy brief and correct, but William had read it 3 times and then passed it to Clara, who read it once and said, "She respects you," with the same tone she used for verified facts. Lawson himself had been quiet. The quiet of a man recalculating, William thought, rather than the quiet of a man who had accepted defeat. But recalculation took time, and in that time other things could be built, and William was building them. Thomas turned 14 in the second week of February. Evelyn made the cake a proper one this time, planned rather than spontaneous with the dried fruit she'd been saving since December. Clara made a card with handwriting so precise it looked printed. Samuel presented Thomas with a rock he had found by the creek, which he described as extremely important, the specific importance remaining unclear but apparently not open to debate. William gave Thomas a pair of good work gloves, heavy leather-sized, right the kind that lasted. Thomas unwrapped them at the table and held them for a moment without speaking. "They're lined," William said, because the silence was getting its own weight. "Good for the cold." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. His voice was slightly different from normal. He cleared it. "Thank you." "You've earned them," William said. "Several times over." Thomas looked at the gloves, then at William, with those gray eyes that always saw more than they let on. "My father gave me my first pair of work gloves," he said. "I was 10. He said they were an agreement, that he trusted me with real work." The table was quiet. "I know," William said. Thomas nodded, put the gloves on, flexed his hands once, testing the fit. "Good," he said, and he went back to his cake. Evelyn looked at William from across the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The thing William had been carrying, that thing Samuel had named so precisely on a January evening, had changed shape over the weeks. It had not disappeared because things like that didn't disappear. But it had changed from a weight into something closer to a compass, a thing that pointed somewhere rather than simply pressing down. He knew what it pointed to. He had known for a while. He was a man who did not act until he was sure, and he was sure, and so the only remaining question was the question of how to say a true thing to a person who had already heard too many things said and not done, who had earned the right to words that were also promises. He thought about it for 2 weeks. He settled on a Sunday morning. He asked Evelyn to walk with him after breakfast. Not unusual, they had fallen into occasional walks around the property, checking fences, or assessing the early signs of the season's change, conversations that moved between the practical and the personal with the ease of people who had stopped needing a reason to talk. She put on her coat. They went out. They were halfway to the east fence line, where Thomas had split posts on the day she arrived before he spoke. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it right the first time, so I'm asking you to let me get through it before you respond." She looked at him. "All right." He stopped walking. So did she. "When you came through that gate in December," he said, "I had already decided to send you away. I had the words. I knew exactly what I was going to say." He looked at the fence line. "I didn't say it. I've thought about why, and I think the truest answer is that something in me recognized something in you before my head had caught up to it. Recognized the way you stood, the way you held your children behind you and still looked me straight in the eye, the way you told me the terms without apologizing for them." He paused. "I let you in because I couldn't think of a reason that felt true enough to keep you out. And then I spent 6 weeks telling myself it was a practical arrangement and nothing more." Evelyn was very still. "It is not nothing more," he said. "It hasn't been nothing more for a long time, and I think you know that, and I think I owe you the respect of saying it out loud, instead of letting it sit in the air between us where we both pretend it isn't there." He turned to face her fully. "I love you, Evelyn. I love your children. I love the way this house sounds now, and the way it feels now, and the way I come in from the barn, and there are people there, and it matters that I came in." He held her gaze. I am not a young man with smooth words. I'm a 46-year-old rancher in Montana who almost shut a gate on the best thing that had ever arrived at his property. But I am asking you clearly and directly whether you would consider making this permanent. Whether you would consider being my wife." The wind moved between them. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the first day, straight level, with the gray eyes that saw through the surface of things to the actual structure beneath. "William Carter," she said, "I have been in love with you since the night of the storm when you sat at the kitchen table at 4 a.m. and told me that missing someone was heavier than being angry at them, and then looked away before I could respond, because you weren't ready." She took one step toward him. "I have been waiting for you to be ready." He looked at her. "I'm ready," he said. "I know," she said. "Yes." He reached out and took her hand, both of them, the way she had taken his during the storm. The same gesture returned the same warmth, and they stood there at the east fence line in the February cold, with the Montana sky above them, and it was not a dramatic moment in the way that stories sometimes made these moments dramatic. It was simply true. Quiet and clear, and true the way the best things were. They walked back to the house together. Thomas was in the yard when they came around the corner, and he took one look at the two of them, at the way they were walking, at the particular quality of Evelyn's expression, at the fact that William still had her hand, and he stood very still for a moment. Then he said to William with a deliberateness that made the words feel like something he had carried a long time and was now setting down in the right place. "Sir, I would be glad." William stopped. "You'd be glad," he said. "If this is what I think it is, I would be glad." Thomas held his gaze. "My father would have wanted someone to look after her. Someone real. Not Harold. Someone real." He paused. "You're real." William looked at the boy for a long moment. "Thank you, Thomas," he said. Thomas nodded and picked up the tool he'd set down and went back to his work. Inside the house, Clara already knew. This was not surprising. Clara always knew. She was sitting at the table with her account books, and she looked up when they came in and looked at their faces and said with the complete directness that was her primary mode of operation, "About time." Evelyn laughed. A real one, full and clear, the kind of laugh that filled a room. "Clara," she said. "I'm serious," Clara said. "I calculated the probability of this outcome in January, and it was high." She went back to her books. "I'm happy," she added more quietly without looking up. "I just wanted to say that." Samuel was summoned from wherever Samuel was, which took approximately 45 seconds because Samuel, when summoned, moved at a single unvarying speed, regardless of urgency. He appeared in the doorway, assessed the room, looked at his mother's face, looked at William and said, "Are we staying?" "We're staying," Evelyn said. Samuel considered this. Then he looked at William with the absolute seriousness of someone delivering a verdict that had been carefully considered. "Good," he said. "Because Biscuit has gotten very comfortable, and I don't think he'd do well in Ohio." Roy Tillman, when told, said "about time," which was almost word for word what Clara had said, and was the longest response he offered, which for Roy was practically a speech. Pete Aldrich shook William's hand with both of his, and appeared genuinely moved, which surprised William until he remembered that Pete had been watching this household become itself for 2 months, and apparently had stronger feelings about it than his ordinarily quiet demeanor suggested. Widow Paulson, when she heard through the inevitable channels of a small valley, sent a jar of her preserved peaches, with a note that said she hoped they'd be very happy, and she intended to bring a proper wedding gift in spring. Gerald Marsh offered the use of his back room for a celebration gathering whenever they were ready, free of charge, which from Marsh was an extraordinary gesture. Bill Henderson came out on a Thursday, his regular workday, and said nothing at all about it, except to shake William's hand once firmly and say "good," and then go to work, which was all it needed to be. The only person who surprised William was Henry Lawson. Lawson came out alone on a Saturday, riding up to the house at a civil hour, and dismounting properly at the gate and coming to the door the way a person was supposed to come to someone's door. William answered it. Lawson looked at him for a moment. "I heard," Lawson said. News travels, William said. It does. Lawson turned his hat in his hands, once a gesture William had never seen from him before, something self-conscious in it, something closer to honest. I said some things earlier in the winter that were not my best judgment. William waited. About the widow, about what it would do to your operation, about... Lawson stopped. I was wrong, about most of it. He met William's eyes. The woman ran your household through the worst blizzard in 3 years, squared off against men twice her size, organized the Henderson place when that family needed it, and the valley is running better for her being in it. He paused. I was wrong. I wanted to say it to your face. William looked at him. Appreciate that, Lawson, he said. Lawson nodded, put his hat back on. Congratulations, he said. To both of you. He rode out. William stood on the porch for a moment after he left. He thought about a valley that had watched a widow arrive with 3 children and made its first judgment quickly and harshly, the way valleys did, the way communities did, the way people did when they were afraid of what the unfamiliar might cost them. And he thought about what had changed it. Not one dramatic moment, not one heroic gesture, but the accumulated weight of ordinary days. Evelyn showing up every morning and doing the work. Thomas holding his ground in a yard when men on horseback tried to push past him. Clara naming the correct attorney over a kitchen table account book. Samuel asking the one question that cut through all the armor and all the noise and all the careful management of feeling straight to the truth of the thing. A family had done this. His family. He went back inside. That spring when the thaw came and the fields turned and the work shifted into its warmer season. William Carter rode into Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday morning and stopped at Gerald Marsh's trading post. He walked to the board where notices were pinned, and he looked at it for a moment. The original notice was gone, had been gone since November when the board was cleaned and reset for new postings. But William had the sense of it, the ghost of those words that had started everything. Ranch cook wanted. Room and meals provided. He had written it looking for one person, someone to make meals and leave him alone in the particular loneliness he had constructed so carefully over 8 years. He had not written it looking for a woman who read survey records and squared off against intimidation without raising her voice. He had not written it looking for a boy who held fence posts and work gloves and his father's quiet example in the same steady hands. He had not written it looking for a girl who balanced accounts and saw what everyone else was too proud to say. He had not written it looking for a 5-year-old who could locate the truth of a thing with one question and then go back to talking to a cat. He had not been looking for any of it. That was the thing about the gate. You did not always know what was on the other side of a gate when you opened it. You could not always calculate the cost or the value of what walked through. You could choose to keep it shut, could choose the safety of the known perimeter, the quiet of the controlled space, the reliable loneliness of a life managed precisely enough that nothing could surprise you. Or you could open it, and something could arrive that rearranged everything you thought you understood about what your life was for. William Carter had raised his hand to close that gate. He was grateful every single day that he had not. He turned away from the board, walked back to his horse, and rode home to a house with smoke coming from 2 chimneys and a 5-year-old probably negotiating with a cat, and a 14-year-old who wore good work gloves, and a 9-year-old who would have opinions about the spring supply order, and a woman who had walked through his gate in December with nothing but 3 children and the absolute refusal to apologize for what she needed. His wife, his children, his home. The lonely rancher who had spent 8 years building walls around an empty house had opened a gate one cold December morning, and what walked through had been the truest thing that had ever happened to him. And he had been smart enough, finally, just barely smart enough not to close it. Some gates opened at the right moment, changed everything. This one had.